today having coffee with Dr. Maya Shetreat Klein, author of The Dirt Cure, and a pediatrician whose book is really fascinating because it looks at children's diets, where children play, that children need to get dirty. This in fact makes them healthier. So I'm really excited to ask Dr. Maya about her book. What inspired you to write this?
Well, I wrote The Dirt Cure after seeing a lot of children who were having chronic illness. And we saw more and more and more chronic illness in these kids, and we wanted to look at why. And so I looked at three major categories in my research and found that microbes, exposure to microbes, healthy food from unprocessed food from rich soil, and time in nature, in short, dirt, were the three things that really seemed to make a big difference in the gut immune brain connection. And that led me to write The Dirt Cure.
So I read in your book that this came about because of your own son's illness and issues. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I initially actually went to medical school because I was interested in becoming a psychoneuroimmunologist, which was something that I learned about watching a Bill Moyer special on healing and the mind when I was in college. But while I was in my training, I didn't really have time to think about that or think about, food or all those kinds of different elements. And I was busy, A, in my training, and B, having three children. And then when I had my son, around a year of age, he started to have rashes. He started having asthma chronically, week after week after week was sick, and a developmental plateau where we actually found that although he had started to develop very early with speaking and saying words, he actually stopped gaining new words. And it was really terrifying, especially as a pediatric neurologist. And so we started to look into what it could be. And over the course of that time, went to a lot of doctors who actually didn't have answers, and just kind of said, well, he's just a reactive kid, that's just him. And, I went to like one of the top allergists probably in the country. And, he refused to test for lots of different foods and would only test for a couple foods, and treated me like kind of a neurotic mother. And eventually, after 10 months, finally, I went to just a local allergist and begged him to do the testing I needed. And ultimately, we found out he was severely allergic to soy. And when we stopped soy, all of a sudden, he stopped having asthma within 3 days and only ever had exacerbations after being exposed to soy. So after all that time, and learning that, I finally wondered, okay, so we took him off of soy, he's doing better, but why was soy so bad for him? Because, I had thought soy was healthy. He was drinking actually soy milk because he was a little reactive to dairy. Dairy made him gassy. So I thought, okay, well, this is healthy. And that led me to understand about genetically modified soy and the kind of pesticides and Roundup that are used on genetically modified soy, what was happening to our food system, how there's a lot of hidden foods in processed foods. So soybean oil is used in most restaurants. We actually subsidize soy crops with our tax dollars. So there was a lot that I ended up learning. And I always say, I scratched the surface and fell into this abyss of information. I'd never realized how much there was beneath the surface.
That's incredible. I happen to eat a lot of soy, so you're making me a little concerned. So there's another interesting piece to this, which I find fascinating. There's the question of both, what kids are eating, but also where they're playing, right? There's a book I'm sure you're familiar with, Robert Love's book, The Nature Deficit. So it's not just that we need to be in nature because it feels good, it's nice to be out in fresh air, it's great to get clean air and that kind of thing, but it's also actually biologically important for us to be exposed to it. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, well, so children in particular, although this is applicable for everybody, we've all really reduced our time outdoors very significantly, especially over the past 20 years, and actually exponentially increased our screen time. Um, and kids now, especially with these standardized tests and Common Core, are spending more and more time in the classroom, kind of learning to the test instead of having time to be outside. Recess is shorter than it ever was before, and very often is taken away. If one child in the classroom misbehaves, then all the children lose their recess time. And even a lot of schools don't have physical education regularly. It
Right.
might be once a
I
week,
know.
and then it might be in a gym, it might not be outdoors.
Right.
So there's a big difference in the amount of time children spend outdoors, not to mention adults, obviously. And what we've learned is, I think most people do find that they feel better when they're outside, when they're getting exercise, when they're getting sunlight during the day, when they're moving their bodies. I mean, all of these things I think are pretty um, accepted. But when we look at the scientific literature, there's a lot of data around spending time outdoors and how that significantly impacts our health. So when children spend time outdoors, let's say even in a very highly natural playground versus a more standard kind of playground or turf, they are more creative. They perform better on standardized tests when they come back into the classroom. So their scores are actually higher. They're calmer. They're happier. That even depends on like the view outside the window. When they're looking out the window at a green environment versus at concrete, they actually have some of those benefits. And interestingly, in Japan, there's a practice that's been studied quite a bit called forest bathing, which is a preventive medicine technique that's employed by doctors and healthcare providers, where they send people into the woods to immerse themselves in the beauty of the forest. And this is something many of us do, right? But when they study the people who are doing this, and this can be people young and old, sick or well, um, their cortisol levels, so their stress hormone levels decrease. They have better sleep. Their mood increases, like it boosts their mood. So they're happier. Their cognition is better. They actually perform better on tasks afterwards. Um, they even have higher anti-cancer proteins that their bodies are
Wow.
producing, and their inflammatory markers, blood inflammatory markers, drop. So there's actually real clinical data that says being out in the forest, being in nature is very beneficial. There's also soil microbes that we're learning about now. As the soil is about 25 holds 25% of the world's biodiversity, and in 1 teaspoon of soil, actually, we find as many organisms as there are people on Earth. So incredibly rich, biodiverse with microbes. And each of these microbes have different actions that they may take in our body. And there's one called Mycobacterium vaccae, which actually boosts serotonin levels in our brains as much as certain antidepressants, serotonin boosting antidepressants. We have an incredible richness from being in nature, being outside, that changes our bodies, and we have a real relationship. We're part of nature, and nature's part of us, and we need each other. When we're separate from each other, it causes problems.
I hope that administrators in public schools everywhere get a chance to take a look at this book. It seems like a really important thing for the children to have this exposure. And so, as you said, so many of them don't get outside. Don't get the recesses can be minuscule. When my daughter was younger, there was often no recess. If there was a tiny drop of rain, because they didn't want to get the kids wet, so you could go a whole day or even for the whole week, and not get outside at all. So it seems really, really important. Is this something that you think is beneficial to adults as well, for adults?
Yeah, I mean, all of this research that I'm talking about is very relevant to humans and animals. I mean, it's not something which is unique to children, but children, because they're developing so rapidly and
See,
are still both physically, mentally, emotionally it actually has to do with their lifelong health. And we're finding, I mean, this is the first generation of children, which, I don't know about you, but for me as a child, I was allowed to run around on my
Oh
own. I
yeah.
was sort of ran with a pack with all the neighborhood kids. I would bike when I was like 8 or 10 years old. I biked all around my neighborhood to my friends' houses and, to the playground. We would roll down hills. We would play tag. We would, play ball. Then we would come home. This generation of children is the first generation that's not getting what we as adults were able to have as children. So I think it does impact adults, and I think we should all be taking advantage of this. It's just that children, I think, are the canaries in the coal mine at this point because they need it and they're not getting
Right.
it, and their
Right.
bodies, brains are screaming out for it.
So where did the word terrain medicine come from? It's your term, isn't it? You came up with it?
Yeah. Terrain medicine is based on this idea of so Louis Pasteur, many many moons ago, discovered the germ theory and wrote about this idea that germs are these organisms which invade our body and cause us
Mm-hmm.
to have disease. And he had a colleague named Claude Bernard, who was also a scientist and a friend, um, or as I joked, a frenemy, because I think they were kind of competing in their ideas. And his idea was actually called the cellular theory. And he said that organisms, microbes, were actually things that lived in our body already and were in harmony with us. And when our bodies became sick, the microbes could become problematic and cause disease. And so now that we know about things like, for instance, probiotics, right? I mean, if you would have asked people 20 years ago, do you think people will take bacteria in little capsules obsessively every day? They would have said you were crazy. We're looking at things like people taking parasite eggs, deactivated parasite eggs to help with autoimmune disease, Crohn's disease, and others. We're actually, even in academic centers, using fecal microbial transplant, stool transplant, from one person to another to treat very difficult to cure infections like what we call C. diff, Clostridium difficile, which can be very persistent and even deadly and is resistant to a lot of antibiotics. So here we have this idea now. We even know now that certain viruses take over for bacteria in the gut. There was an amazing article in Nature just at the end of last year that talked about the microvirome and how viruses can take over in bacteria in germ-free mice where their guts have been cleaned, sterilized of bacteria.
Hmm.
Normally there would be a lot of disruption, and now we know viruses can take over it for the bacteria. So it's quite
Right.
fascinating. So many other things. We're even using measles now as an oncolytic to kill difficult to cure cancers like glioblastoma multiforme. There are some amazing papers in the scientific literature. So now we know that germs are part of our body, that microbes of all kinds are part of our body, and that our bodies may need a lot of different diverse organisms. And so this idea of it's about our terrain is, first of all, that our bodies are one with the world around us. We're actually only about 10% human DNA. The rest of our bodies are microbial DNA. So it's quite, we are our terrain, and it matters the health of our terrain. Our inner terrain reflects the health of our outer terrain.
I imagine you're not a fan of Purell and these antibacterial soaps. And I also am guessing you're going to suggest that people try not to eat food that has a lot of pesticides in it. I know you were on Dr. Oz recently, and you were talking about the sort of 15 clean foods that don't have to be organic, but that are better for you. They tend to have less pesticides that get into the body of the fruit or the vegetable.
Well, I definitely would say using plain old soap to wash your hands is far better than using things like Purell. And actually, um, there was a study that came out last year on bleach that showed that in homes or schools where bleach was regularly used, the children had a 20% increased chance of getting the flu or chronic cough, as compared to where bleach wasn't used regularly. So I think we're starting to rethink the kinds of chemicals that we're using to sterilize the environment. And pesticides, in a sense, actually sterilize the soil. So they prevent, the beneficial bacteria from influencing the plants, and they actually need that influence. And then they actually go on to, appear in our own food in traces and actually disrupt our own bodies. And there's a lot of links to ADHD, to cancer, to birth defects, to infertility, to celiac disease, and other things related to things like Roundup or organophosphate pesticides. So I definitely recommend eating organic when possible. The Clean 15 have the least amount of traces of pesticide on them, even if they're not grown organically. And you can look that up online on the Environmental Working Group website. Growing your own when possible, or going to farmers markets is another great thing to do, and I recommend that.
Eating locally. So I guess the main thing, I hope that, it's this sort of change in mindset. We think that we're keeping our kids safe by having them as clean as possible, but in fact, that's not really the truth. We're harming their little bodies, and they're losing the ability to have resistance to so many important things. And the kind of natural way, and I hate to say natural, but the way you and I grew up, I was out building mud pies and climbing trees, and I was barefoot. All that is actually really good for us. Thank you so much, and it's such an important message, and this idea of us being part of nature and connected to it, that terrain concept is really beautiful, and I thank you for your work, and I recommend your book to everyone, so thank you.
Thank you so much.